Welcome to the River Trip, a monthly program here on KSJD that highlights the stories of river runners and the issues facing the Dolores River. I'm your host, Jay Loschert. I work as the program coordinator for Dolores River Boating Advocates, a group of whitewater enthusiasts based here in Montezuma County. On the River Trip, we feature guests from the boating community who share their stories about running the Dolores River. Tune in on the second Thursday of every month at 8:30 a.m. for river news, culture, and history. And you can get involved and stay informed about the issues facing the Dolores River by visiting the website of Dolores River Boating Advocates at www.doloresriverboating.org. Or you can call me at 970-799-1475. Today I'm very honored to have as my guest in the studio Tim Cooper. Thanks for being here, Tim.
You're welcome.
For those of you who don't know him, Tim has worked as a Grand Canyon river guide for 38 years, and he pioneered a first descent of the Little Colorado River with Brad Dimmick. And he's a published author. In fact, one of the publications where his work is featured inspired me to begin collecting stories from Dolores River trips and to launch this radio show. So, Tim, I'd like to start off with a little personal history. How did your river running career begin?
Well, I guess my first mistake was my choice of colleges, which is, I went to school at Prescott College. It was a four-year small private institution in Prescott, where I was incidentally a member of the Prescott Hotshot crew. One way I financed my education, so that's kind of a rough thing for me to absorb right now. But I discovered kayaking at Prescott College. They had a program there, and not being much of a team sport player, I discovered that it wasn't because I had no athletic ability whatsoever. It was just that I was more cut out for the individual things. So it became an obsession with me, I guess. And upon graduation, I tried to figure out a way that I could keep doing that as a way of life and a way that you could actually keep body and soul together. So I applied right out of school to both the Idaho Forest Service, where they had a kayak patrol position on the Middle Fork of the Salmon that was opening up, and I also applied for a commercial river running company in Grand Canyon, Canyoneers. And I got both of those jobs, much to my surprise, and I managed to work it out to where I began the season in Grand Canyon, ran a couple of trips on their motorboats, went up and ran the season, which is short in Idaho, working for the Forest Service, on sweep rigs, different kind of boat they run up there, and kayaks, and had a great time, but discovered that law enforcement wasn't really my stronghold. So, and fell in love with Grand Canyon on the two trips that I was down there. So decided that that's what I wanted to do, and went to work for Canyoneers the next year, where the trips were a week long, fastest trip offered in Grand Canyon. And you can run a lot of trips, which I did, and got a lot of experience, but decided that the 7-day schedule was shortchanging Grand Canyon, and went to work later that year, the next year, for Grand Canyon Dories, which offers the longest schedule through Grand Canyon. Their shortest trip was 18 days, the longest was 22, and worked there for 13 years full time. Wow. So since then, it's been some years I won't go at all, but most years I will, at least some, and I've been down twice this year already, and probably will go a couple more times.
Okay. So, how have you seen guiding change over the years?
Guiding hasn't changed that much. The clientele has changed dramatically. It's just become a lot more expensive. When I started, you could run a trip through Grand Canyon. Georgie White offered a trip through Grand Canyon for under $400. Now it's more like $3,500. Wow. It sort of cuts down on the pool of potential clients that way, and I think those people that pay that much have different expectations.
Sure. So, Tim, I want to ask you about a story you wrote that was published in a book called There's This River, and it was a story you wrote about running the Little Colorado River with another guide, Brad Dimmick. And first, I'd like to say that your writing is just brilliant. I was just reading the first couple pages of the story right now again. And second, I'd like to say that the whole trip seemed ridiculously dangerous and, obviously somewhat illegal. How did the plans for that adventure evolve?
Well, I'm going to have to say that it was Brad that was the instigator more than myself. And he had come up with this program for us that we were going to run every possible tributary of the Colorado that could be run. So we started with the biggest one that enters the Colorado in Grand Canyon National Park. We ended up actually following through on that as much as possible, when you're young and crazy, which doesn't last that long. And so we had the year, we had the water, which is a rare thing. It was a wet year, and we were watching the gauge, the USGS gauge. Back then you had to call somebody, but we were watching it come up, and we just said, there it is. It's now or never. We had put together some maps that we'd made out of clear shelving paper and USGS topo maps, and just decided that, well, permit or no, we don't know what we're going to do. The water's going to go away soon. Let's just go ahead and try it. So we threw our boats on, and the rest is history.
Yeah, so there had not been a descent.
Not a successful one. There had been attempts,
right,
but nobody had made it before.
But you didn't have any real knowledge of what lay around the next corner.
That is the real different thing about running a river that's never been run before, because you don't have any idea, and the anxiety level sort of ratchets up dramatically when you have no idea what's around the next corner.
Right.
And it's a steep river. It's not easy, and we discovered that it had plenty of potentially dangerous features
and there was really no escape. Once you get into the gorge, the walls are very sheer and
yeah. Once you're down there, you go past a certain point where it's just barely wider than these giant kayaks that we were paddling at the time. They're 3 meters, now they're down to like 1.5. But yeah, you go through a stretch that it is impassable on the upstream direction, and after that, you're committed. The only way out is to go downstream. So that's what you do.
But you made it, and you're sitting here today.
Yeah, we made it, and it was not without other hazards that we knew were coming our way, because we didn't have a permit, and we knew that we were going to end up on the Grand Canyon, Colorado and Grand Canyon, which is illegal without a permit. And back then they were having a big controversy between the private and commercial uses. And there was a guy that just published an article the year before that was called The Big Sneak, who had done it without a permit and done it in 49 hours, which was a record at the time. But they were looking for someone to hang, basically, and we presented ourselves as the perfect example.
And you got caught.
We got caught. We passed a ranger trip. After you run the Little Colorado, none of the rapids in Grand Canyon really looked like that much from a kayak. So they were scouting. The ranger trip was scouting Hance Rapid, which is a good idea, but we just went ahead and ran it, and they were yelling at us from shore, "This is a big one," and we went, "Oh, no, it's not," and went ahead and ran it. But the radios are a lot faster than kayaks, and so they just radioed ahead to Phantom Ranch and said, "Look for these two silly guys in their boats down there and catch them,"
right.
Which they did. And so we got fined, and we had to chopper the boats out, and they talked about barring us from Grand Canyon for a while, but the chief ranger was a really nice guy, later became a friend, and he kind of thought what we had done was cool. So he decided not to hang us completely and ban us from Grand Canyon. I'd do it again. I mean, it only cost us like $300 back then.
Sure.
That was a lot of money, but...
And the memories are priceless.
The memories are priceless, and, it got our boats out of the Grand Canyon. It's like otherwise we would have been stuck down there. So, helicopter ride. I think back then it was like 20 minutes in a helicopter with a slinger load. It cost like $220, something like that. So now it'd be $3,000, but, yeah, it all sort of worked out, and I got this great story material out of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and if folks out there are listening and haven't come across this book, I have it in front of me here. It's called "There's This River." It's Grand Canyon Boatman Stories, and it's really interesting and inspiring. And Tim actually has a couple pieces in there, including his tale of running the Little Colorado. So I highly recommend it. Check it out. It's from This Earth Press. All right, we're going to take a little break. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to The River Trip on KSJD. My name is Jay Loshert from Dolores River Boating Advocates. We've been talking with Tim Cooper, a local river runner and Grand Canyon guide. And when we return, we'll hear more from Tim about some adventures that he's had on the Dolores River. Welcome back to the River Trip on KSJD, your monthly taste of Dolores River history, news, and culture. We've been talking with Tim Cooper. I'm your host, Jay Loshert. Before we continue, I'd like to remind our listeners that Dolores River Boating Advocates offers the community many ways to get involved in protecting the river that sustains our community. Visit their website at www.doloresriverboating.org to learn more. So, Tim, you've seen the Dolores River at various water levels, but I'd like to ask you about the highest level you've seen it. And I understand that you've risked life and limb on the upper Dolores with your entire family, no less.
Yeah, it maybe wasn't the best judgment, but I can actually lay most of the blame on my wife because it was Mother's Day, and we said, well, what would you like to do for Mother's Day? And she said, I want to go on a river trip. And I said, well, we don't have a lot of options today that we could actually do that. But there is the Upper Dolores, which was running, as it turns out, at the high water of the year that day. And so we said, okay, let's go ahead and try it. I'd been down the stretch from Rico to town once in a kayak at about, I think, 1,200 CFS. Well, as it turned out, checking later, it was 5,000 CFS that day. And we went up to Rico with the whole family thinking that we might have a pleasant little jaunt, quick, pleasant little jaunt down through the entire part of the river from Rico to town.
And that's 60-some miles on the highway.
Well, yeah, I think we figured it's around 30 on the river, something like that. Anyway, there's a number of different places up there, and we found a place to put in right below Rico. But it's consistently fast. I think it drops around 50 feet per mile. Grand Canyon drops 8 feet per mile and has some huge rapids. But the Dolores is really consistently spread out gradient, and so it just never stops. So at 5,000 CFS, what you're running is pretty much one continuous rapid, at least standing waves. Wow. So we put in thinking that, well, this will be a fun, quick trip. The water's cold, but we had a raft that was a bucket boat, so you're marinating your feet all the time. It doesn't just go through the boat like the new self-bailing ones do, but this was a stable, tough Riken manufacturer raft, and we'd had a number of places, been down Grand Canyon, and so we went ahead and put on, and it was just screamingly fast. I think we were making about 12 miles an hour as we traveled downstream, and the first thing that we came to was a tree, maybe I don't know, 60, 70-foot gigantic tree. It was probably 4 feet around at the base, ponderosa pine that was black as if it had died in a fire and then fallen into the river. But it was the tip of it was on the bank on one side, and the root ball was just barely in the water on the other side. And when we came around the corner and saw the thing, it had rolled over a few times, but it didn't serve to break all the branches off. They broke off and were sticking out at all angles, kind of like an Iron Maiden that was turned inside out, kind of just this prickly thing with foot-long spikes all over it. And we didn't really have much time to think about it, but as it turns out, there was adequate water that was flowing through the weeds on the left. I mean, it was nothing but vegetation, but there was nothing to do but crash into it as hard as you could and dive for the floor, which is something I've never really undertaken as a strategy for river running that much. But as it turns out, it's pretty handy on this. And there was we crashed into the veg, and branches were going everywhere, and the oars were going around. I had to lay on the floor because the oars were whipping back and forth over my head. But we made it through there and pushed off and ran through the broken branches back in the river, and thought, now, boy, that was really something.
And you had kids with you, right?
Yeah.
It's not just you and your wife.
This was in 2006, which meant that the kids, I think Morgan was just graduated high school, and Ryan was in college and home for the summer. But they'd been down a lot of rivers and had a lot of experiences. They swam Crystal Rapid in Grand Canyon when they were like 9 and 12. Little misjudgment there, but...
this is a recurring theme, Tim.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
hearing this more than once.
I don't know. Maybe it's, not learning your lesson. But the next thing that we found that was a problem was Well, when you boat enough, you develop a skill. It's called reading water, which is basically a suite of experiences that you've had and expectations about how water is going to behave, whether it's going to pull you right or left, what a shallow rock looks like from above, how certain hazards are. And I looked downstream at this one point, and it looked like the river was written in Sanskrit. It just didn't make any sense to me. It was a line. It looked like there'd been a grove of trees grow up overnight right across the current. I had no idea what was going on. So in the middle of this really fast water, we just pulled up onto the pasture land on the left, and it was high enough that we could do that. There was actually water flowing out into the grass, and went down and looked at it, and what it was is the river had overtopped this cottonwood covered bar like a fire hose. Instead of going in its usual channel, which was this extreme hard right turn, it had just gone straight ahead and was sieving through this cottonwood grove with good-sized trees as thick as the hair on a dog. And it was seining out all kinds of other debris, and there was just no way through. You couldn't float a boat through there. And if you did try, it was going to be big trouble. I mean, you'd be stuck, you could be, boat punctured, wrapped, whatever. But there was maybe 20% of the water that was going right around this thing. The thing is that that 20% was on the other side. So we had nothing to do but climb back in the boat, hold us, get our angle right, and push off and just row like I'd never rowed before. I mean, I was blue in the face. My wife tells me that you've never rowed that hard before. But we did make it around there, and then below there, the river rejoined its original channel for about the next quarter mile, flowing through and over this cottonwood grove that was the strainer of a lifetime going by. And I began to think at that point that perhaps this wasn't the best idea for a Mother's Day expedition. But
it wasn't your fault.
It wasn't my fault.
It wasn't your idea to
It wasn't my idea. And everything thus far had sort of worked out, but we kept going, as you don't really have a choice. And somewhere below Circle D campground up there, we came around another corner, S-turn, and looked downstream, and it was another one of those things that just doesn't really compute as a river runner. You're going, what is that? They were big green trees, right, stuck in the middle of the current. They were kind of going up and down like Moby Dick might be, and they had in full leaf a couple of different species of trees. And you thought, they're not growing in there. What's going on? So as we got closer, my son said, cable! And what had happened was that a cable car to the opposite bank that serviced the cabin over there had been hit by a tree, a good-sized tree that fell on it and dragged it into the water. And then the cable itself was seining out all kinds of stuff. And the two big things were a couple of different trees that were stuck on this thing. But the cable was at water level. And the boat is too. And so all that we could do was to row for the weeds again. And I rowed as hard as I could, ran the boat up in the weeds, which slowed it down a little bit. But Ryan reached out and grabbed an armload of papyrus and slowed us down, and the boat swung to a stop right up against the cable. So it was that close. We stopped against the cable. And then we were able to pull it upstream to where the cable was a little bit higher, because there was a piece of steel about the size of your thumb, and we managed to get the boat underneath it. But I get the thing that was the more consistent hazard, I think, is that there are a number of bridges across the river that have been put up by people that just have a single cabin they want to service, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of oversight on how high above the water they put these things. So on the way up, we'd had to stop, and we measured a couple, and they were just barely enough. And as you laid on the bottom of the boat again, you could see that the oarlocks were almost going to hit as you went under them. And later, one of the bridges collapsed next week that we'd gone through. So
after you'd been under?
After we'd been
just
under,
right after.
I think it might have even been the next day.
Oh, boy. Wow. So we might subtitle this show, Don't Try This at Home, Kids. Well, Tim, sorry, we are running out of time, but I want to thank you, Tim, so much for joining us, Tim Cooper. This, I have to sadly announce, this is likely my last show as your host, but the River Trip will live on with some new talent. Tune in next month on August 8th at 8:30 a.m. for the next edition of the River Trip. And thanks for joining us today, and a special thank you to Tom Yoder, who's been our engineer throughout the River Trip, and my coach and guru, radio guru. And thanks to KSJD for supporting local programming. We will see you on the water, folks.